Well, if I had a gavel here, I might drop it down and say, "Court is in session," because this is where we start to get into some fun stuff. We've spent 3 periods looking through 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and looking at the resurrection as Paul discusses it there, defends it, explains it a little bit, certainly told about the prophecies leading to it, and of course the witnesses of it. Such huge points to consider about the resurrection. We remind ourselves that as we talk about the resurrection, we're talking in a sense to maybe some folks who aren't here but might be watching at some point, and we are encouraging them to consider the evidence for the fact that Jesus died and then lived again, rose again, and lived. But for us, as a reminder, it's an encouragement. So I enjoy this, and I hope that it's encouraging to you as well. See, when we compare world religions, Christianity stands out. Christianity stands out for more than one reason. First of all, our writing, the Bible, is the only document that teaches us logically and understandably where we came from, our origins, the origins of mankind, the origins of the universe. It's the only one that tells us about God, the real information, what we can understand and respect and have awe in God about. His omniscience, His omnipresence, His omnipotence, His great love for us, His expectations. It's the only thing that tells us what we are doing here. What is our purpose in life? How many times do you hear people say, well, God's got a purpose for me? Well, I just believe that God has a purpose for my life. And where I can, I like to take him to the Scripture and say, you know what, God doesn't have a specific purpose for you more than anybody else. He's got a purpose for all of us, and it's to obey His Son, obey His Word. And He's given us the evidence for that by raising Him from the dead, Acts chapter 17, verse 30 and 31. And so when we, again, putting these things together and looking at Christianity and how it is distinct from other religions, the biggest reason is because we have a risen Savior. We have a Savior who defeated death for us. Others might make that claim, but they do not have the evidence for it. The resurrection of Jesus will always be one of the most discussed, denied, and defended events in the realm of religion. This kind of claim, with evidence to support it, can't be ignored. It can't be ignored by anybody who even has a shred of interest in the world around them and the world that's beyond what they can see, has any interest in salvation and what they must do to be saved. You have to consider the evidence for the resurrection. So our courtroom is in process now. We're having our introductory thoughts, but what we're going to look at in this particular sermon this evening is the prosecution. So on trial is not necessarily Jesus himself, but the resurrection, the fact that he came back to life. So the prosecution is going to give us some reasons to not believe that Jesus rose from the dead, and then we are going to answer those. And then in the next 2 sermons, the defense stands up and gives some evidences to consider of why to believe that Jesus indeed was risen from the dead. Now, let me put this up here. So, just before I get started, say a lot of what I'm doing, framework for it anyway, comes from this book by this title, "The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus," and I believe I put there's the 2 authors. I read this book a few years ago. I really liked it. They're denominational in their thoughts, so I would probably disagree with them on some things, but their main goal in there is to just look at external evidence. Now, I would say not just to look at external evidence. They look at the Bible as well. But they don't get into the Bible a whole lot, so you don't get a lot of their denominational, the differences that we would have. They are doing what we want to do here, simply looking at some at the Bible and then a lot at external evidences that need to be considered if you are going to doubt the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so this is what we're going to do, and I offered that. And so if you want to look at that book, you certainly can find that. But when I say we're going to look at extra biblical sources, I want to bring this out first. The Bible, some would say, is not inspired. Therefore, we cannot introduce it into this court of law because it's written by uninspired men. What should we do with every other writing then? Because if the Bible is not written by inspired men, then it falls into the category of every other writing that has ever been written or ever will be written by uninspired men. Do we discard those as evidence? No. The Bible is a credible historical document. You do not need to believe that its writers are inspired to see what it says and consider the evidence in it along with the evidence in uninspired writings. Other uninspired writings, as the person might say. Okay, the point of this sermon series is not to prove that the Bible is inspired, but we can use it. So I may reference that from time to time, that the Bible doesn't matter whether they think it's inspired or not. It's a credible historical source, and we need to consider it as such. So what we will just look at this evening is, let's see, I got about 7 points, 7 arguments, claims about the resurrection that people would bring. And some of them, most of them, we won't have a ton of information to say about it, and you'll see why as we go through. For example, the first one, there are other resurrection stories. Or someone say, other religions have resurrection stories. And so I was looking at a few of those. Maybe you've done that before, and you looked at some of them. I can tell you most of what I look at has to do with fables, different types of stories, clearly fictional, things that are usually very unclear. They seem to contain contradictions, unclear in the sense that even if you wanted to accept it as fact, you really wouldn't understand what actually happened there. I could give you some of the names of those, but I don't think it's really worth our time. Justin Martyr, I'll reference him a few more times in here, posthumously called martyr for his martyrdom. But Justin Martyr lived from AD 100 to 165. According to him, the details of the stories that he would read were vague and lacked evidence, were not at all like Jesus' resurrection. As one writer said, today's scholars would not regard the stories as parallels, and anyone can read those stories and tell that they don't fall into the same category as what we see in the Bible and the stories regarding Jesus. So initially we'd say other resurrection stories, even if we don't have any examples, even if we don't have anything to say about that, would that change the facts about Jesus of Nazareth? To say, well, we've got some other stories that might be similar. Okay, well, you can study those stories, but those don't change anything regarding the facts surrounding Jesus. So that doesn't provide any reason for me to change my views and not believe in the resurrection of Jesus. Our second one, Jesus didn't really die. You ever heard this one before? Jesus didn't really die. It's called the apparent death theory or the swoon theory. So Jesus didn't die. He came close to death on the cross, and then he revived in the tomb, but he never actually died, and that would explain a lot of stuff now. Okay, well, let's consider the apparent death theory. By the way, before we do, there's 3 things to consider, 3 points regarding Jesus of Nazareth. Number 1, he was a real human being. We'll talk about that tomorrow. Number 2, he died, and then number 3, he lived again. To attack point number 2, now we're going to assume, as most people do, that number 1 is true. He was a real human being and he lived. To attack number 2 and say he didn't really die, what does that admit about point number 3? They have unintentionally admitted that he was resurrected. They wouldn't say resurrected because you're not resurrected if you don't die. But look, if I said everybody knows a certain man died yesterday, and I stand up and tell you he did not die, why would I say that? What reason would I have to say that that man didn't actually die? Because there's witnesses that he's alive right now. So what I like about this view is that it unintentionally supports the third part of it, that Christ did live after his supposed crucifixion. Well, let's see if it's supposed or not. The Journal of the American Medical Association, this was in March of 1986. The Journal of American Medical Association. Y'all may have studied this before. I bet you probably have at some point. If you heard where preachers now and then will do that sermon that's very important, but you don't necessarily like hearing it. The details of the crucifixion, the scourging, what the whips looked like, everything that happened so that you can kind of follow along almost like it's happening on the screen in front of you and watch what happened to Jesus. A lot of that detail comes from this. The Journal of the American Medical Association, they researched Roman scourging and crucifixion. And I won't give you all this. There's a ton of information, very, very interesting. I just have a couple of quotes here. But regarding scourging, they said that scourging was intended to weaken the victim to a state just short of collapse or death. So we're not even to the cross yet. And scourging was intended to get you very close to death because they wanted you to hang on the cross. Remember, this was a message. You were being made an example of don't commit crime. You don't commit crime against the Roman Empire. You think about what they were doing and that they had this empire and they'd conquer a land and leave a certain number of people there, leaders, garrisons, whatever. They don't want rebellion. You ever heard of the term Pax Romana, Roman peace? That's what they were about. They want Roman peace. And all that means is you pay us our taxes and we let you do what you want to do and we keep the peace. So they did not want crime to continue. They want to control this. And so it was designed to put him on the cross, leave him there for a little bit as an example, and then he dies. And of course we know in John chapter 19 what happens if they don't die in time. They come out there and break the legs so that they can't push up and get air. All those details that we see from this particular journal. It says, it goes through all these details regarding the scourging and the crucifixion and what happens, and regarding the concern and view that Jesus didn't actually die. Here's what they said. They said, accordingly, interpretations based on the assumption that Jesus did not die on the cross appear to be at odds with modern medical knowledge. In other words, you're going against truth to say that. Plus the fact the Romans were experts at torture and death, particularly crucifixions. I believe that they would have taken extreme offense at the claim that Jesus did not actually die. This is why the soldier pierces Jesus in the side and pierces the pericardium around the heart. So if he wasn't dead already, he is going to be dead very shortly. There is no way. Here's something else too. Remember, this is the view because I don't want to believe in the resurrection. I'm going to say, well, Jesus didn't actually die. Okay. So even with all that, and the Roman soldier who hears that, if he were to come back into the future and hear you say that, he might take that spear to you right now. But somehow, Jesus was just unconscious. And so he revives in the tomb. Then what? How does he roll that stone back by himself in such a pitiful condition that he is? Do you think he would have even been able to sit up, but then roll the stone back and somehow walk on severely wounded feet to his apostles? And then what would have been the response? The apostles, who multiple times heard Jesus say that he would be put to death and that he would rise again. Matthew chapter 16, Matthew chapter 17, chapter 20, chapter 26. 4 times I can think of there in the book of Matthew that he foretold that he would die, but that he would return from the dead. And here he comes, knocking on the door somehow with whatever strength he has, because he's not the Messiah. Because if he's the Messiah, God would raise him from the dead. Isaiah chapter 53 we looked at yesterday. So all this view would be that he's not the Messiah. And so here let's call him what he is. He's a fraud because he claims to be the Messiah and he's not. He's a pretty strong guy, I can tell you that, because he was able to do all this. Do you think that would have convinced the apostles when this shell of a man shows up looking like he is? I don't think so. So as we talk about this one, I think I'm going to go with the the scientific and medical facts on this one and say that he died. And the majority of the views and the scholars agree that he died. But we deal with that one anyway. So the next views, now we're going to talk about, okay, well, he really did die, but he didn't come back to life. Okay, well, let's continue. The witnesses went to the wrong tomb. You ever heard this one? The witnesses went to the wrong tomb. Okay, well, let's consider that one. They actually believed that Jesus died and that he rose again because they showed up to a tomb with a stone rolled away, and they just assumed that Jesus had come back to life. Well, what would happen then? Well, first of all, then only those witnesses would be the ones to have seen it, and that would be a few women and 2 apostles, Peter and John. By the way, where are the other apostles? Why didn't the other apostles come and check it out? Peter and John were convinced. I mean, it wasn't the right tomb. The right tomb was maybe a few feet down, and it's still sealed and everything. So they went to the wrong one. People throw things out like that, and you just wonder, did you follow this out to its logical conclusion? So only a few people would have known. How many people would have gone and checked it out? Because again, Christianity has spread since then. All this ridiculous religion that has nothing to do with anything because it wasn't real, because Christ and his bones are still there, I guess. They just went to the wrong tomb. At some point between then and now, nobody went to the right tomb. Do you think that the Jews who paid the guards to lie and say the disciples stole the body, do you think maybe they would have checked that out? I bet that's the first thing they would have done. When the word gets to them, and maybe even through the soldiers themselves, the guards, who told them the truth, and then they said, well, we'll pay you to tell a lie. Do you think somebody might have gone to check that out? I bet they would. So this should easily be debunked, and it would have 2,000 almost years ago. The Roman leaders would have done it, yet there's not one bit of secular historical evidence that anyone ever did this hugely important task of going to verify that they got the right tomb. By the way, I asked, what about the apostles, the other apostles other than Peter and John? Why didn't they go check it out? Is there any evidence that they ever went to check out the empty tomb? Well, we find out later when the defense gets up and talks about the apostles, because they claim to have seen Jesus. They all saw the resurrected Jesus. Would there really be any need to go look and see the empty tomb and see if they were looking at the right one when Jesus is standing in front of them? By the way, did they know where the tomb was? It was the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, which Matthew 27 says is a rich man, and I believe was a member of the council, the Jewish council. In other words, this is not some nobody. So I bet they could have found that tomb quite easily. No, this excuse doesn't hold any water either. Next one, and this would be the most famous one, I would imagine. Obviously, even the scriptures say they were told to lie and say this. The disciples stole the body. This one would, and I think of all of them, this one makes the most sense from me, the prosecution's view at this point. This is the one I'm holding to, I think. The disciples stole the body. The disciples had just committed 3.5 years of their lives to this man and his teachings. And he said he would die and rise again. I don't believe he did. Therefore, I believe that they wanted to save face and stole the body and either destroyed it or hid it where it could never be found. And that's what happened. And the prosecution sits down and says, I'm pretty comfortable with that right now. And the defense says, okay, let's draw this one out to its logical conclusion. All that happened. Then what? These apostles started a religion that's still going today based on a lie? Who led that? Who led that? Peter? Mr. Denial? So these men lied about this whole thing, and we wonder where they were at that time. After his death, where were they? Were they at the cross during his death? What about during the burial? Where did they go? Scripture talks about them hiding, talks about them fishing. Yet these men supposedly did what they did, were able to do this. Why would they do that? What's the motive behind this? Again, the prosecution says, well, they just want to save face. It's embarrassing. Oh, I get that. I think there's some understandable truth to that if indeed he didn't rise. But what happened from that point on? Again, we look at the church, and amazing, the church still on the earth, spread around the globe, 2,000 almost years later, and here we are, all based on a lie? What happened to these men afterwards? I mean, here we go. They stole the body somehow out from under the noses of the guards. They stole the body. They destroyed it or hid it, whatever they did. Nobody found it, even though many would be looking. They corroborated their story. They swore never, ever to change their story, and then they went to their deaths for it. Now, here again, I said this is the best argument I think that the prosecution has here against the resurrection of Jesus, is that the disciples stole the body because, of course, they would want to. But it doesn't really hold together when you see what happened to the apostles. We have Fox's Book of Martyrs, the discussion. So again, extra biblical, outside the Bible, historical document, speaks of what I think it was Bartholomew was skinned alive. We don't have to go through into all the details of what happened to these men. And remember, they weren't all together. Can you imagine this small group right here, all whatever lie we're going to admit to, we're all going to perpetuate this lie. And so we all agree. Everybody put your hand in, and we're all going to say, all right, we all agree. We will never, ever tell the truth on this. And then we all go our separate ways. And here you have me all by myself. Y'all aren't around to say, don't you do it, don't you do it, when they persecute me and my life is being threatened in very horrific ways. I talk about torturous ways that these men died. And not one of these men recanted without any of the others around to point them, don't you do it, die. For a lie? Who dies for a lie? One of the arguments against this was that Islamic militants die for a lie all the time. Is that the same? Islamic militants, if you had that Islamic militant standing there with a bomb wrapped around him and he's about to kill himself and a lot of other people, and if you could pause and ask him why you're doing this for a lie, he'd probably kill you first. He's not doing that for a lie, not in his mind. He believes he's going to be rewarded for it. That is not the same thing. These men allegedly knew it was a lie and got tortured and killed for it. That would be a pretty good evidence that whether they were right or wrong, they believed that they saw the resurrected Messiah. So the claim that the disciples stole the body ends up being the most ludicrous, I think, claim against the resurrection. So we move on. If the disciples didn't steal the body, well then, somebody else stole the body. And to that would say, okay, well, who did it? Who would have the motive to do that? The Jews? Obviously not. If the Jews had stolen the body, it would be simply to hang it back up and display it. And the Romans would certainly have no reason to steal the body. They had nobody to apologize to. They do what they want to do. And they would defend their decision on that. So, if someone still believes that the body was stolen, then they need to provide who stood to gain by this. And this would only account for the empty tomb. Remember, as we look tomorrow and the next night, and we look at the defense giving reasons for people to consider why Jesus indeed rose from the dead, only one of those is the empty tomb. There are several other evidences. What we have here, the disciples or somebody else stole the body, if they could prove that, or at least hold to that in their own minds, that would only answer the empty tomb. That does not answer what happened to the apostles. That certainly doesn't answer the conversion of Saul of Tarsus. So many answers that does not provide. This is a nice one. The disciples hallucinated. You ever heard this one? We'll have one, I think it's tomorrow night that I'll be talking about this, giving an example of a otherwise intelligent human being who at least seems to imply this as an answer to a certain point that we'll be looking at. But the disciples hallucinated. Here's a quote. People tend to hallucinate when tired, stressed, and grieving. And the apostles were all three. Tired, stressed, and grieving. Well, I can agree with you, I guess, on those last 3 points. They were tired, stressed, and grieving. But the response is pretty simple when it comes to group hallucinations. You just say it back to them with a question. Group hallucinations? Hallucinations are things happening in one person's mind that aren't really happening. Seeing something that's not really there. If a second person sees it too, that proves it's not a hallucination. How many times have you seen that? Maybe some, sci-fi type of movie where somebody goes, I just thought I saw, and he looks at his friend, and his friend is going, you're not crazy, I saw it too. There's the evidence that it's not a hallucination. You're not hallucinating. Well, we have over 500 at once, according to Paul, and you've got multiple accounts of the church fathers, quote unquote, the historians, talking about the apostles. And then we'll look at this one tomorrow, but talking about the apostles and the things that were said that shows that multiple people had this, quote, hallucination, which shows it was not a hallucination. So the hallucination theory is not very good either. But after his death, he was seen by Mary Magdalene in Matthew chapter 28, by Peter and John in John chapter 20, by the apostles without Thomas, Matthew 28, the apostles with Thomas, John chapter 20, the two on the road to Emmaus, Luke 24, the apostles again in John 26, I believe, John 21, and then over 500 at once in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Paul, the church persecutor, claimed that the resurrected Jesus had appeared to him. Acts chapter 22, verse 7. Was Paul, what was it? Let me see, tired, stressed, and grieving? Is there any evidence that Paul was tired or stressed? Certainly not grieving. He didn't want to see Jesus return. So this doesn't fit, doesn't answer that one either. He was not hallucinating. The last one we'll look at. The disciples were delusional. Kind of the same idea of the hallucination thing, but delusional. What does delusional mean? Generally, it's the idea of believing something against all the evidence. So all the evidence is against it. So the prosecution says, the disciples were just delusional. Okay, what's the evidence? I'm not going to stand up yet. It's still your turn. What's the evidence that they believed against? What is the evidence? It's kind of circular reasoning in a way, and it's certainly self-defeating. There's no evidence to say that they're delusional. So the person who says this needs to provide evidence that the apostles were ignoring. Well, the only evidence is the fact that I just don't want to believe in the resurrection. And people just don't come back to life. Wait a minute. Even in the Old Testament, people came back to life. We talked about that yesterday. They died again, but they died and came back to life. So it's not new. And those things were documented. Why can't you believe it? Even Paul said when he was on trial, why should this be so amazing to you that God could raise the dead? Why should it be? Because we're not talking to atheists even here. We're talking about, as Paul was dealing with in 1 Corinthians 15, even brethren. Why is it? And I've seen this in writings before from folks who are skeptical about different miraculous events of the Bible, who believe in God and believe that we are here by the power of God, and yet won't believe in certain miracles, because God could create the universe and all things in it, but then he doesn't have the power to manipulate it in a miraculous way. Now, why would that be? Why could you believe in one and not the other? And Paul is saying, why is it so amazing to you, unbelievable, that God could raise the dead? Well, that's the reasoning behind the disciples were delusional. I would ask, who deluded them? One of the things I think one of them said was, you've got groups like the Branch Davidians and what are some of those groups? People's Temple, was that one of them? And Heaven's Gate, and these groups that just blindly follow some leader. Okay, which leader did they blindly follow? Peter? Again, he's Mr. Denial. And we talked about these guys were all fishing and hiding when this all happened. And again, multiple people claim to actually see him. And again, what about the persecution that these men suffered because of this? None of that woke them up out of their delusion. And again, it doesn't account for Paul, who had no desire to see a resurrected Jesus. He was on his way to persecute Jesus' followers. So that doesn't fit at all. He was not delusional. So these are some of the best accusations that people can make against the resurrection, and none of them really holds any water. Matter of fact, I like to say, if you are considering whether something is true or false, and here's somebody who says it's true, and here's somebody who says it's false, well, you want to listen to both sides. But if one side makes no sense, if their only arguments are all insufficient, easily answered, and sometimes just downright absurd, then it kind of pushes you to the other view, doesn't it? I always say this regarding the origins of mankind. Is there a God? How did we get here? All these things. And the atheist says, well, let me explain to you how we came here. For somebody who's truly open-minded to the truth, I say, why don't you go ahead and listen to that guy? When you're done, come on back and I'll tell you the truth. Because when you go over there and he's a very intelligent human being, lots of scientific knowledge and letters behind his name, PhD of this and whatever, and he says we got here by a big bang. Everything exploded into being. And mankind evolved from, as Brother Thomas Warren would say, rocks and dirt. Things that were non-living became living somehow with no reason for it. Impossibilities. And you hear that and you go, okay, and you kind of pat him on the back and go, okay, let me go find that theist. Let me go find the Christian and hear the truth. Kind of the same idea with a lot of this stuff. You listen to what they say, it doesn't hold a lot of water. And so you want to stay and hear the defense as the defense makes the arguments that we want to listen to in the next couple of days. So if none of the opposing arguments make sense, then maybe we should do what God said in Matthew chapter 17 at the Mount of Transfiguration, and says, this is my beloved Son, hear ye him. Listen to him and obey him. Well, that's our lesson for this evening, and I want to encourage all of us to not only be encouraged by these things, because you have made the right choice in following Jesus of Nazareth. He really did rise from the dead, and then be better equipped to teach those people around us.